Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event titled Lines of Defense. This is the second in Stone and Chalk's cybersecurity series, and this afternoon we are incredibly lucky to be joined by a very special guest speaker who I'll introduce in a second. Now, today's event could not be more topical. There's been a slew of hacking-related headlines lately. You would have seen Twitter get swept up in a massive crypto scam. You've seen Garmin, Canon, Reddit, and a host of other articles coming out around hackers increasingly exploiting companies' vulnerabilities and also taking advantage of the transition during COVID-19 for workers to be working from home. Today, we're going to cover a range of topics, everything from really unpacking and understanding why some of Australia's cyber defences have been failing. We'll also be looking at fraudulent crime in Australia and what you as a business can do to protect yourself. And finally, we'll be answering as many questions as possible from the audience. It's great to have had a fantastic turnout for this afternoon's event. And before we do kick off, just some quick housekeeping. Gabriel and I are really encouraging this to be an open conversation. So we'd love you to post questions via the Q&A function, which we'll be passing on throughout. Thank you for everyone that's already provided a question. We will try and get to them during the session as well. And we'll save a couple of minutes at the end for Q&A. Finally, there'll be a short survey as well as a copy of this presentation shared after the event. Now, it's great to see we've got close to 100 registrations for today's event. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Stone and Chalk, just a few words before we kick off. Stone and Chalk is a non-for-profit. We were founded in 2015 with a really fantastic mission to nurture, connect, and propel those entrepreneurs seeking to solve some of the world's most pressing challenges. We now support over 800 entrepreneurs at any one time and have flagship hubs in Sydney, Melbourne, and down here in Adelaide. So without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Gabriel Haythornthwaite. Gabriel, welcome. Great to have you. Sorry we can't have you down in Adelaide. Got to love those COVID travel restrictions, but thanks for joining us at Stone and Chalk in Sydney.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah. Now, I was reading your bio and doing some LinkedIn stalking just before, and I'm going to put you down as one of the most modest speakers that we've come across, because you've written down, Gabriel knows enough to be dangerous about cybersecurity, which is then followed by a very long explanation as to who you are and what you've done. But for those of you that might not be familiar with Gabriel, he was actually the co-founder of Redcore, who, amongst many other things, helped the RBA design the interbank clearing system. He's designed multiple security systems around the world. He works really actively with large corporates and government. And Gabriel was really quite fortunate, and we were just debriefing earlier, to sell that business Redcore to Accenture a couple of years ago. So Gabriel, thanks for joining us. We've got a lot of content to get through today. Cyber tends to be one of those conversations that you can go in many directions and go down very many rabbit warrens, but really it's a pleasure to have you. And maybe we start by just having you introduce yourself in a couple of minutes to the audience before we kick off.
Okay, well, yep, the name's Gabriel. I'm an Irishman. I'm a complete charlatan when it comes to information security, but then I guess when I came out of uni, there was no such thing as information security or as a discrete discipline. So I have no formal qualifications whatsoever, but I started out my career in that area in the mid-90s and have been playing in that space ever since. And I formed my first company in 2002, specializing in that area. And then, as Chris has mentioned, we sort of merged with another company, formed Redcore, grew to about 150 staff in 5 different countries, and got taken up by Accenture. And I'm now back to being a free agent again, which is much more fun, much more fun.
We can see the spark in your eyes. And it's good to know you've been working in cyber for longer than some of our residents or Stone and Chalk founders have actually been alive. So that's a good credibility tick for you as well.
So look, a little bit of background on where this presentation actually came from. And like a lot of things, it came out of a conversation I had a long time ago. And we were doing a job for the tax office at the time, who were busy doing a business process re-engineering program. and we were working on the security element of that ultimately became known as the Oz key. And a certain lady in the tax department, who shall remain nameless, pulled me aside and said, Gabriel, why can't we just do the same as what the banks do? You know, and I rather frivolously answered her and said, because you don't think about the problem space in the same way. She said, yeah, I'm not going to let you away with that. You know, what do you really mean? And being Irish, I guess I answered a question with a question. I said to her, well then, what to you would be a tolerable level of fraud? And as I expected, that rather flummoxed her. She said, well, to the tax department, no fraud is acceptable. And I said, well, there isn't a bank anywhere in the world who would answer that question in the same way. In fact, every bank knows how much fraud they're prepared to tolerate. Every bank knows how much fraud they're actually suffering from, and you know how much fraud they have actually had to, or how much money they've had to write off to fraud every year. If you can't answer that question, you're never going to think about the problem in the same way as the banking sector does. Anyway, somebody else overheard this conversation, and they pulled me back a couple of years later and said, you know, the tax department is actually out updating what we're doing. We're trying to become a lot more engaged with users. Can you tell us a bit more about what the banks do? And because we work both in federal government a lot and in the banking sector, you know, I said, yeah, sure. So this presentation actually came out of that discussion and was originally given to a bunch of senior executives in the tax office. And then actually a bunch of other federal government departments asked to see it as well. Fantastic. So that's the spiel.
We're going to hold you to the magic answer. What is the acceptable amount of fraud that the tax office will accept in any 1 year? I'd love to know more about that, given I haven't yet to file my tax return. But please, would love for you to take it away and kick off the presentation. And for all of those online, please don't forget, just drop a question into the Q&A. We'd love to have them throughout the presentation. And Gabriel will also be putting out some questions to the audience. For those of you who are lucky enough to be the first in with the correct answer, I'll also ship you a brilliant bottle of South Australian wine produced by one of our residents down here in Adelaide. So get ready, hot on the keyboard for when Gabriel puts those out to the audience.
Good stuff. So can you see this? Excellent. All good. So no presentation on fraud is complete without some explanation of the fraud triangle. Seems strange. Can you actually read that lettering? That's better. Thank you. The fraud triangle's been around forever, but basically the theory goes like this, you know, for any act of fraud to occur, three things need to be in place. There needs to be a need or motive, there needs to be the opportunity to commit the fraud, and there needs to be what they term the rationalisation, which is basically people saying, I'm okay doing this for whatever reason. It's useful to actually think about it in that way, because it means if you're suffering from fraud, there are actually three different avenues you can explore to tackle it with. You can attack the need, you can attack the opportunity, and you can attack the rationalisation. So there are multiple ways of tackling fraud in any situation or in any organisation. Now, need most people understand pretty well. In fact, you could always argue that everybody is motivated to commit fraud. But a key point that is worth noting is that in every recession since the 1950s, and it's very topical right now because we're sitting in the middle of the mother of all recessions, there has been a marked increase in white-collar crimes, and consequently fraud tends to go up. So let's look a little bit then at rationalisation. I tend to think of this in terms of there being two classes of people: those who think they can get away with it and therefore don't care very much, and those who do it for different reasons, if you like. And they don't really care if they get caught one way or another. So two examples of that. One are, I guess, the original people who wrote viruses, the script kiddies who did it for bragging rights, if you like, and got very excited about it. But you also have people like Snowden here who did it for ideological reasons and were prepared to actually, you know, break the law and do that kind of thing. So equally, you have those who think they can get away with it. And I've got my beautiful picture of a hacker here, you know. And what we have seen in recent years is increasingly the attacks moving away from the kids doing the bragging rights and moving far more into the criminal domain. To a point that now most online fraud is really an industry. The people who write the malware don't generally use it. The people who harvest the credit card numbers don't generally use them. They sell them on the dark web to one another. And so effectively you've got a whole economy around committing fraud to target the financial services sector and any other sector in the industry. To a point now that these figures are relatively old, but the price of a credit card on the dark web dropped to below $1 at one point, where after a major hack in the US, credit card with a CVC number was about $3. And if you want it with the PIN as well, it got up to about 10. And you could get custom malware written for, you know, give or take $3,000–4,000 as well. So it's not, the price of that has actually dropped as well. Okay, so moving on, looking at the final corner of the triangle and opportunity. Now, obviously, the people with the most opportunity are those who are inside your organization. And that can be anybody who has access to your internal systems, you know, part-time staff, full-time staff, third parties, you name it. If they've got the opportunity, they need to be, you know, considered as being people who might, just because of various circumstances, want to commit fraud. What can you do about it? Well, with insider fraud, there are well-known controls. You know, procedural and structural controls I mentioned. I mean, I find it fascinating to actually think that the principles of double-entry bookkeeping have been around since the Roman times. And yet it's so often you go into government systems and there is no concept of having a particular task approved by another individual to prevent fraud in the same way. Separation of duties is, you know, it's well ingrained into a lot of accounting practices, but it's missing in an awful lot of controls we apply to different systems. Obviously, audits and supervision help to reduce fraud, as does enforced leave. Now, if you can't think why, have a bit of a think about it and send your answer to Chris now, and we'll come back to that point. But it's a highly effective control. Finally, identity and access management, but essentially ensuring the right people have the right access to the right things at the right time, and nothing else. So moving on a bit, looking at it from the perspective of those who are committing the fraud. I put this in a long time ago, but effectively, direct attacks are difficult and inefficient. There are far easier ways of breaking into most organizations and most people's systems than a direct attack on their defenses. Though, generally speaking, if an organization is committed enough to getting in, they will find a way in. But the weakest link, invariably, are people. There's a nice little quote there from the god of crypto, Bruce Schneier, who says, "Only amateurs attack machines, professionals target people." I'd never heard of this Friedrich von Schiller character either. If any of you have heard of them, you can tell me more about him later. But I do like his little quote. He says, "Against stupidity, the gods themselves contend in vain." There is an awful lot of truth in that. People do dumb things. And I count in that not just people who are customers of an organization, but very often it's the organization themselves that do dumb things. One thing that I tend to rile against a lot is people introducing overzealous and, to my mind, very stupid security controls. And I'll give you a little bit of an example of one of those now. And I'm going to ask you a question at the end of it all, which will be a fabulous prize opportunity. But a long time ago, I did a job for, let's just say, a major government department. I won't say which one. And they had a very interesting problem, but their outsourcers' fees had jumped through the roof. And they went and looked at why their outsourcers' fees had jumped through the roof. And it seemed that everybody was doing password resets. All of their staff had started to do password resets, a lot more than they ever used to. And they were somewhat perplexed by this. And so we did a bit of a dive into it to look at it a bit further. And the first question I asked was, well, when did you last tweak your password rules? And they said, oh, it can't be that. We did it 3 months ago. And I said, what did you do? And these are the things they did. It was a classic stuff. It was a case of they, made it a combination of letters and numbers, had to have, at least one irregular character, couldn't be any of your last 10 passwords, and had to be at least 12 characters long. So there was nothing terribly sensational in there. But suddenly 3 months later, they had had a massive increase in password resets. Why? I've told you the answer. If you think you know why, send it in to Chris now, and we'll see at the end of this presentation whether you've got it right. Cool. So I'll move on a bit from there. That's better. I make this point, but most organizations haven't a clue about the value of the data they actually have. Most criminals have a better idea of what your data is valuable for and as than you do. So most organizations, when you actually talk to them from a cybersecurity perspective, don't think about how or why somebody would attack them.
Gabriel, can you give us any examples of, types of data that we might not think are particularly valuable, but are sought after?
I guess I mentioned in the preview to this talk, but I mentioned health records. But health records are heavily targeted by cyber, hackers, essentially. And it's nothing to do, the reason they target them is absolutely nothing to do with the health information that's in there. In fact, a health record on the dark internet is worth, give or take, it varies, but between 30 and 60 bucks US. It may be even more at the moment. Whereas a credit card, as you saw, is worth only about $1. And the reason for that is actually less than obvious, but health records also carry with them your full address history, your next of kin, your mother's maiden name, your real date of birth. In fact, everything that is necessary to conduct a fraud attack on you is there. And this is information you can't change. You can't change your history. You can't change your address history. You can't change your date of birth or anything like that. So that's why it's so heavily attacked by people on the dark web. Is that a good enough example, Chris?
Love it.
Yep. Most intrusion detection systems don't work. I'll come back to that point later. It's a very interesting point and very topical at the moment in the work that we're doing for some of our other customers. So how serious is the problem? Getting data on this is actually invariably difficult. And the reason for that is that most organizations don't like to publish when they've been hacked or when they've been attacked. In fact, they will do everything they possibly can to keep it out of the media and keep it quiet. But this is some data I fished off the internet, and these are estimates, but 5.1 trillion or 6.05% of GDP worldwide is a recent estimate of what it's actually worth. It's quite a lot of money. In the US, 3.7 trillion. Scams cost Australians around $500 million, according to the ACCC. And that was in 2019. So if you haven't fallen victim to a scam, you know, keep your eyes and ears open. The AFP claimed they prevented $1.7 billion in fraud against federal government organizations, 590 convictions. So that's an impressive number. I was a bit surprised when I saw that too. Cybercrime damages $6 trillion in 2021. And they're saying that cyber attacks are considered around the top 5 risks to global stability worldwide. So I guess what I'm saying here is the problem is serious and it's not getting any better. These figures are from Mr. and Mrs. IBM, but they reckon the average breach in the US was around 8 million and took on average, give or take 200 days to detect and 69 days or so, you know, to contain and address once they'd actually discovered the breach was going on. A lot of breaches go on for a lot longer than that, like the Target breach, which went on for years before they actually exfiltrated all the credit card numbers they'd harvested. So I promised I'd talk a little bit about attacks on internet banking, which we know a little bit about because we've worked in that sector for quite a while. I'm not allowed to tell you how to break into banks. That's illegal. Don't do it. But I can tell you some of the common tools of the trade. So phishing attacks have been around for quite a while. Most people know what they are. Basically, they amount to scams. You know, you click on an email, you think it came from your favorite bank, and you then click on the link, and suddenly you're on a fake website, which looks like the bank but isn't, for example. Or there are many, many other scams that are out there. For any of you that are, you know, motivated to do so, have a quick look at that URL at some stage. It's actually, there are whole rafts of people throughout the world who enjoy the sport of baiting the scammers themselves and persuading the scammers to actually reveal their identity and basically scamming the scammers with often very amusing results. You know, I am going to marry Luigiana in Russia, but you know, and I will send $2,000 for her to come over and join me, and I'll even give her $3,000 if she can, so she can come business class. But first, can you please send me photos just to prove this and that about yourself? So a lot of people have a lot of fun in that area. Anyhow, smishing attacks were an interesting little development. They came about after the banks first started sending OTP messages, basically passcodes to verify a transaction to people via SMS. And it was an interesting effect that had, because you think about it from the perspective of the clients. The banks had done a very good job of telling everybody, never trust an email that claims to have come from us. It's probably fraud. But then they started sending them SMSs. And of course, people immediately thought, well, we can't trust the emails from the bank, but we can trust an SMS from the bank, which then, of course, led to things like this happening, where people would actually hack into your account, which is quite easy to do. They'd get your username and password, but they couldn't get a hold of the SMS easily. And so they would send a message like this to people saying, oh, we think you might be getting these SMSs fraudulently, forward them to us, and with amusing results. Man-in-the-middle attacks have been around forever and ever and ever. You know, I think the first historical instance was the Gauls used to beat up some of Julius Caesar's messengers, and he introduced the first ever cipher codes to get around that. A less well-known one was in the First World War, just before the Americans joined, but the British were able to intercept the German cables going to their embassies in the US countries, or in the American countries, and to decrypt them. And one of those particular cables was soliciting the help of the Mexican government and saying, we'll side with you in the event that the Americans decide to side with the British. Now, this, of course, was political dynamite, and it created a huge problem because they didn't want the Germans to know that their codes had been broken. So they came up with a relatively ingenious solution, which was to fake a break-in to the ambassador's office in the States, scatter copies of this cable around the place, and then call the police and say there's been a break-in to the ambassador's office in the US, in the sure knowledge that the police would find it. And that, in case you're not aware of it, is the real reason why the Americans came into the First World War on the British side. It was nothing to do with the sinking of the Lusitania, as most people think. So anyway, enough of the history. People ask me where my man in the middle is. So, you know, he's hidden in there. And I'll give you another thing that nobody will ever tell you, but I've met a few of these gentlemen. They don't actually wear balaclavas. It's a bit of an urban myth. Keyboard logging Trojans have been around forever, basically ways of capturing your password from your machine. I'll talk a little bit about man-in-the-browser malware because that's particularly insidious stuff, and if you're not across it, it's worth understanding at least the principles of how it works. But you know, within a browser, you have a GUI, which is basically the user interface and displays all the screens you see at the front end. And at the back end, you have all of the encryption stuff that talks to the bank and authenticates itself to the bank. So with a bit of malware, you can insert yourself in between those two, and our friendly hacker down here can actually control both what you see and what the bank sees. And they can be two totally different things. So you think you're doing a particular transaction to pay $100 into your wife's account, but in reality, you're paying it into the hacker's account. And then they can go even further, and they can control the balance you actually see on your screen. So you're not even aware that money has been siphoned out of your account. So you can do things like inject fake web pages, change transaction details, modify the balance shown, and then this malware does another little trick, which of course is to hide. It buries itself to avoid detection and confuse analysts. And it actually assumes the identity, wherever possible, of something you know and trust. It can assume the identity of the browser itself. So the browser becomes the malware, or the malware becomes the browser, to all intents and purposes, which makes it very hard to detect once it's present. Anyhow, skipping along, I'll talk a little bit about the government perspective on this. And the government perspective is very much dictated by their standards, which they use, which come straight from defence. They come from the Australian Signals Directorate, who are a defence organisation. And they have this wonderful concept of defence in depth, which you're probably aware of, but I'll just quickly recap. You have your perimeter defences, which are things like your firewalls and your intrusion prevention system. And then you have your defense in depth, which is things like your intrusion detection system, data encryption to keep it safe in the event that somebody does break in, and your security incident and event management system, which is used hopefully to detect people on the inside, but not terribly effectively. I'll come back to that point later. And then finally, you have gateway defenses, which are things like a VPN, identity and access management authentication, and use of passwords and two-factor authentication. It still staggers me how many organizations just use passwords. I mean, it was 2004 that Bill Gates told the world the password was dead, but people still use them to this day.
On that topic, Gabriel, we've had a couple of questions come through from the audience
Mm-hmm.
asking about services like Dashlane, LastPass is another popular example, obviously. Just how effective are they for securing information? And can you elaborate a little bit more on, I guess, your comments around Bill Gates announcing, you know, a long time ago now, almost 15 years ago, that the password is dead? Like, what does that actually mean from a business context?
Well, what it means essentially is that we've had keyboard logging Trojans and malware around forever now, pretty well over 10 years. It's very easy to steal somebody's username and password. I've had some very interesting conversations with government departments on this topic because their immediate defense is, but we've got secret questions and answers too. And you think about that and, you know, the reality is that ain't going to help you, because if you've got a keyboard logging piece of malware, that's going to reveal the secret question and answer just as well. You know, when you're thinking about how you actually authenticate anybody, it comes down to one of three things. It has to be something you know, which is the password, something about you, which is potentially a biometric, or something you have, which is a key. But it needs to be one of those three things. And if you're trying to actually strengthen how you identify people, ideally you don't go for one of the same class of things. You don't go for secret questions and answers in combination with usernames and passwords, because the way you break one is the way you break the other. You use one from a different category. So there are things like, you know, use of OTP, which effectively is sending a message to your phone, which proves you've got something else, proves you've got that phone number, or SMSs fall into the same category, or we've got, you know, a whole plethora of forms of identifying who people are from biometrics as well, be they fingerprint readers or facial biometrics or iris scanning, you know, the list goes on and on and on. But ideally, you're using a combination of those things to identify your clients, not just the one. So skipping on, I mean, this is tends to be, or used to be, as far as most government standards went. And there's a fundamental problem here in that these standards are great for Fortress Australia if you are the Department of Defence. But I liken it to having a Navy and an Air Force without having a police force. Because how do you actually detect when you've got fraud going on inside your organisation if all you have is a Navy and an Air Force? It's pretty difficult. You do need a police force as well. And the other problem with this is that most organisations don't live in ivory towers, but a lot of their staff, as we're seeing now, are actually out in the field working remotely and from home, and all their customers are out in the field working remotely from in home. So you can't just assume that you've got this rigid perimeter that bad guys have to get around in order to break into you. You need to think a little bit more laterally about it in terms of, well, actually, how would we know if our client's machine has been broken? And the working assumption most banks have is that their client's machine has been broken, and it probably has, in all reality. The chances of there not being any malware on there are pretty remote. And they need to assume that there is malware present at all times. So to actually look at how well these things work, perimeter defenses, yes, they work, but they have limited impact on fraud. Defense in depth and gateway defenses that are prescribed, the nicest thing I could say about that is they're partially effective. What you really need to be looking at beyond that, if you're a government department, are further controls that you potentially are not doing. Things like audit, procedural and structural controls. A lot of government departments go completely blank when you start talking to them about structural controls. They haven't a clue what you mean, which I find astonishing. But, you know, again, they've been around forever in other domains. And you need to be looking at data analytics so you can actually detect fraud. This is another point that amazes me, but if you actually look in the banks, every single bank in this country for give or take 15 years now has had real-time fraud detection systems in place. to actually analyze transactions as they happen and flag those that look fraudulent. And yet, in federal government in Australia today, I'm only aware of one federal government department that uses real-time fraud detection. So that's a classic example to me of why, or where there are massive disparity between the controls which are being used in industry and the controls which are being used in government. Again, I think it comes down to the standards that are put in place. Client-side controls that actually work. You've got strong two-factor authentication. You've got dynamic anti-malware in applications, and you've got things like hardened browsers, which are increasingly being used in the banking sector, or being provided to clients. Okay, so skipping on, I'm aware of time, so I'll try and keep this as brief as I can, but I was asked by the government for, you know, what should we be doing? And so this is what I showed them at the time. And, you know, I had to reiterate ASD advice, which at the time was catch, patch, and match. So catch means application whitelisting. In reality, outside of government, very, very few organizations do it. It's far more difficult than people would like to think. If you don't have a standard operating environment that you can force all your staff to use, then application whitelisting is probably not going to work terribly well. Patching is well understood, and that's basically ensuring that your patches are applied and up to date. But again, it's surprising how many organizations that is not true for. This is just basic homework. And matching the right privileges with the right people, and looking closely at what your admin privileges are. That's a vitally important point. I mean, in the time that I was running Redcore and its predecessors, I can count 5 times I got essentially the same phone call. And it would usually be late at night. And it would usually come from the, you know, the security officer or somebody who was working with them. And it would usually start with, "Hey, Gabriel, got a bit of a problem here." And I'd say, "Yeah, what? Go on, do tell." And they'd say, "Well, you know, one of our admins was abusing his privileges. He had his eyes on one of the girls in HR and he hacked into our email and we caught him out for it and we've had to send him home," or something like that. The only problem is he's got all of our passwords and some of them we've never actually got around to rolling. And how are we going to deal with this little problem? So if you haven't thought about that, I would strongly suggest you do. The problem is surprisingly common. Otherwise, I wouldn't have got that call 5 times. And there are some excellent bits of ways of addressing it. You know, in all of those instances, we were able to help people. We back again? Cool. So other things I suggested to federal government, you know, don't think purely in terms of your perimeter, but think in terms more of detection and response. This is basically ensure you've got a police force as well as your customs, as well as your Navy and Air Force. You have to actually, in this current day and age, accept that people will want to bring their own devices with them. You can't keep enforcing your SOE forever. And look at real-time fraud detection and analytics if you aren't already doing so. Then I said, you know, support fraud defenses that work. And these are, again, the things I talked about earlier, things like enforced separation of duties, structural controls that nobody in federal government understands what you mean, periodic audit of your privileges and your accesses, and increasingly now investing in detection services that actually work. I'll talk a bit more about that later because I think a lot of organizations intrusion detection systems don't work terribly well in the current environment. And if you don't believe me and you think you're totally safe, hire a red team, a competent red team, and let them prove to you otherwise. This last point, you know, it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but my wife's an evolutionary biologist, and it strikes me that in the information security game, the attacks are changing constantly. The defenses are changing constantly. But you can't lock yourself into a position and hope that's going to work in a year's time, in a month's time even, let alone in 10 years' time, as a lot of government departments tend to do when they next look at upgrading their security defenses. You have to be agile. You have to keep looking at ways of improving the way you track down the hackers, and you have to look at multiple defenses. And this other point is kind of poking fun at them a little bit, but you know, looking at federal government in particular, a few years ago, if you like, they all shared the same DNA, and that was called Microsoft Windows in one form or another, but that was all their staff were ever allowed to use. And then, of course, people started to want to bring their own devices along. And it depends on your perspective. I mean, you know, their perspective was, other device, we don't understand it, ergo it's bad. But if you think about it from the perspective of the attacker, that's actually not true at all. Because if you're trying to actually perpetuate a fraud, it's very easy to create a fraud that will attack Windows and completely fool all of your Windows users. But if they're using other platforms, you've got to actually ensure that you can attack those too in the same way. And that makes the task much harder for people who are actually trying to perpetuate a fraud if they've actually got multiple platforms, because you've got to attack all of them at the same time. So having diversity in your DNA, if you like, is actually a good thing, in my opinion, contrary to what a lot of people have said. Anyhow, I said I'd dive a little bit into what is, I'm finding quite a hot topic at the moment, about breach detection and management. You know, how do you do it? These statistics are relatively recent, published by Mandiant, who are one of the major players in actually addressing cyber attacks once they've been detected. But 53% of successful attacks are not detected at all. And close to 100% of incidents don't generate an alert at all in most people's systems. So they go undetected for long periods of time. Now, anybody can tell you the truth in this. I've cited IBM and numerous other sources, but go and Google it if you like. But it's well known that the cost of actually dealing with any form of fraud goes up exponentially with time. As Target found out, they had a fraud that went on for over a year, and huge numbers of credit cards were harvested in that time. If they detected it in the first month, it would have been a minor incident. It became the biggest cyber attack in history because they were unable to detect it. And yet, when you look at what most organizations spend their cyber defense budgets on, it looks like this. You know, your typical spend is actually 80% on prevention, very little on detection, and even less on response. In fact, you know, when I actually push organizations on this topic, if you really push them hard, a lot of them will actually tell you, off record, of course, that I think we may be compromised, but I really don't want to know, because if we have to know about it, we have to report it, and then we got to deal with it, and we got to alert our customers, and the whole roof falls in. So maybe it's better if we don't look.
Gabriel, I'm sure many on the call sort of share that, or at least can emphasize with that sentiment around, you know, you don't know what you don't know, and actually it can be scary to sort of roll back the curtains, so to speak.
Well, you know, what you don't know about, you don't have to deal with.
But yeah, that's right. What would your advice be for particularly, you know, a lot of people on the call who are small businesses in terms of thinking about the limited pool of money that they put aside for cyber? and thinking about prevention versus detection versus response from a
Look,
budget allocation.
I personally think if you're looking at your cyber budget, you should be looking at roughly equal spends in all three of those all three of those sections, if you like. So 30% probably on prevention, 30% on detection, and the rest on dealing with the actual events. You're far better off invariably knowing about the attack early, dealing with it early, nipping it in the bud, rather than actually being blind to it. And then it becomes one of the $8 million incidents that I referred to in one of my earlier slides. Or you can sit and wait. But the reality is, if the bad guys want into your organization, they will find a way in, whether you like it or not. It doesn't matter how good your perimeter defenses are, they will find a way in. And I would share that advice with any organization. I mean, the posture of saying, I don't want to know about it, I use that image. It's actually maligning the emus. Emus don't do that. It's only humans that are that stupid. But I'll talk a little bit about the traditional approach to detection. And we've done a lot of this work historically, but what people still are advised to do by a lot of standards is to put in place one of these security incident and event management products. And my former company spent a lot of money putting in Splunk for this purpose. And the next thing you do is you aggregate all of your firewall logs and you feed them into this amazing detection engine. And maybe you then go to Mr. and Mrs. Verizon and buy yourself a threat intelligence service. And that will tell you about various forms of attack that are going on at the moment. And then you have a bunch of your staff who are running your security operations center, or your whatever you want to call it. And they will write some very clever rules that look for patterns in your log data. And that will then hopefully tell you where the attacks are going on, at which point you start catching the bad guys. Now that might have worked 10 years ago to a very limited extent, but there's a fundamental problem with this picture. In fact, if you think it will work for you, and if you think you are safe and you've got this set up in your own organization, then I've got some very nice silver bullets I'd like to sell you for $500,000. But I don't actually believe that to be the case at all. If you actually want to detect intrusions, you need to be doing a lot more creative things than just that. I mean, the other fundamental problem with this, of course, is that if the firewall knew that what it was seeing was bad, it would block it. So if you're just looking at firewall logs as your only way of detecting badness, you're never going to find all the forms of badness that are out there. What in reality happens is you start drowning in alerts. You end up with, even with the filtering that your CM is providing, you end up with more things to go and investigate than you actually have time to do. And if you've only got half a dozen staff manning your security operations center, your cyber operations center, or whatever you want to call it, they're going to be spending most of their time doing this and probably won't even have time to update the rules half of the time. And this is what, in reality, when I go and talk to people we installed Splunk for historically, seems to be happening. To actually to detect the bad guys for real, you need to be a lot more creative than that. And there are products you can buy that do this, but you need endpoint detection software, you need traffic analysis, and ideally the ability to replay traffic after the fact so you can work out how an attack happened and when it happened and who was influenced by it and where the malware has gone and everything else. You need dark web intelligence. I was talking not that long ago to a federal government department about this very topic, and they had their cyber operations center up and running for close to 3 years, And I was in there with one of the vendors of a service that actually could have helped them detect bad things that were going on. And anyway, we went through the presentation to them and they said, but yeah, we're sure we're okay. And I said, so, you know, in the 2 years that you've been up and running, how many actual live attacks have you actually detected? And the answer, of course, was none. And at that point, you know, we had to say to them, well, you do realize that you have 3 of your server usernames and passwords up for sale on the dark web right at the moment, and around 30 to 40 of your staff accounts, which was a bit of an eye-opener for them. They had no idea. They were completely in the dark. So this is why, as I say, this approach isn't reliable anymore. Other things that I find work extremely well are things like honeypots. You know, these have been around forever. A friend of mine who's the CISO for another federal government organization actually independently thought he'd have some fun with this, but that organization used purely Windows machines, and he decided he had a spare Linux box. And so he thought, for shit and giggles, I'm going to connect this Linux box into our network, and it will do nothing but sit there. And if anybody ever pings it or tries to contact it, I'll probably know they're up to something bad, and it will send me an email. And they then got in the services of, I won't mention which organization, to actually run their SOC for them, their Security Operations Center for them. And a few months later, he started to get pings from his little box, and he went back to the people running the SOC, and they said, nah, if there were badness going on, we would have detected it. And he said, I'm fairly confident there's badness going on. It took him over a month to convince them that there was an attack in progress, but the honeypot had done its job at that point in time. Other things that a lot of the organizations that specialize in this area do is actual threat hunting. So they go out and actively try to track down threat inside their own lake of data, which they've accumulated. If you're a large bank, you're probably doing all this stuff already and you're well catered for. But if you are a smaller organization, I would strongly suggest not building one of these systems. There are far more effective ways to spend your money. And I think it's a classic example of where outsourcing of the detection function makes an awful lot of sense. There are specialists in this area who do the job a lot more effectively than you will ever have the resourcing to do with half a dozen people in your own organization. The reality, of course, is even if you go and buy any of these silver bullet products I've alluded to over on the right here, all they tend to do is actually create even more alerts, which mean you end up drowning even further. Again, it becomes a specialist task. In reality, what I've found most organization staff who are working in their SOCs then do is they end up with so many open alerts that their bosses get unhappy, and so they will privately tell you that they're going to close them quickly so that management don't complain. Not good, but that's probably closer to reality than most people would like to admit. Okay, so I'll quickly bring this to a close because I'm sure people have questions, but you know, in summary, financial sector fraud attacks always will go for the weakest link, and that's clients and their devices. Humans are far weaker than most systems. Structural and procedural controls do work. So if you're a federal government department, think about putting them in place. Threats evolve constantly. The world is not standing still. You know, learn from biology, you've got to update the whole time. You've got to vaccinate yourself against the latest attacks that are happening. For over 10 years, in fact, it's close to 15 now, all banks have had analytical fraud detection software and real-time fraud prevention systems in place. And as I said earlier, I'm only aware of one federal government department that actually uses that today, which is still staggering to my mind. And I strongly suggest that you either, if you don't have one already, conduct a fraud risk assessment or update your fraud management plan. I mean, this slide over on the right is actually coming from Mr. and Mrs. Macquarie, but they make the point that 80% of organisations in Australia don't have an up-to-date fraud risk assessment in place, or even an up-to-date fraud management plan. If you're struggling in that area, again, call me after this because we can definitely help you then. And if there's one thing I really want you to take home from today's presentation, it's assume you've already been breached. You probably have, even though you may not know it. You know, invest in a good detection service. But I'd strongly suggest you don't buy based on the brochures. Try and test them before you buy. We've worked with organisations to do this, but, you know, install 2 or 3 of them and, if you like, listen to the sales spiel, but then hire a red team to try and breach you at the same time and see which of these excellent fraud detection services actually detect the red team. I think you'll find the results very revealing, but it's a huge mistake to go and buy one of these services off the shelf based on the brochureware. There are far too many silver bullet vendors out there who will try and tell you that their solution solves all malware problems. And they're telling you great big porky pies. So avoid silver bullets. And if you think your SOC or CM is working, go hire yourself a competent red team and let them prove it to you otherwise. So that's it, boys and girls. I'll hand back over to Chris. Does anybody manage to actually answer my little question that I posed earlier?
We've had a couple of answers rolling in, and we might loop back to them in a second. But thank you very much, Gabriel. I mean, it was quite incredible, I think, to just look at the you know, what is quite eye-opening when you say that some of these comments have been around 15, 10, 5 years in the industry, and what is accepted best practice in some pockets like financial services really just hasn't translated through the rest of the economy yet. Lots of takeouts and a couple of questions that have come through online, which is great. Just a reminder for those that have asked, a copy of this presentation will be shared. And I'd encourage you now, if you haven't already, just jump on, feel free to submit a question, and we've got maybe about 5 minutes for a few more questions. Gabriel, just to kick things off, we've had a few questions come through around the role of biometrics, specifically some comments around the Australian government and financial services starting to adopt fingerprint and voice. Could you talk us through, you know, what is the future in terms of the role of biometrics in the security stack? And, you know, are they safe? Should we be worried about our personal privacy? Yeah, what are your comments?
Biometrics are never 100% in reality. You know, if you actually look at any biometric detection system, I'm not an expert in this area, it's not my area, but the way I understand it is you will try to tune them for optimal results. And the optimum point is typically where your level of false positives and your level of false negatives are actually the same. So, you know, and for each form of biometric and each system, you will actually get different percentages, but a lot of biometric systems are in the order of 3 or 4% when you tune them optimally, which means that, you know, 3 or 4% of people are able to actually get through on somebody else's passport, or 3 or 4% are actually flagged as being somebody that they, or flagged as not being the person they actually are, for whatever reason. Now, I don't know what the figures are for, you know, the biometric gateways that are used in Australia now. But certainly I know that historically, at least, I've never seen a biometric system with less than 1% as being the sort of optimal point you can tune it to. There may be some out there now, but I'm just not aware of them. They absolutely have a future, though, and they are absolutely incredibly useful because they, as a mechanism of checking people's identity, they do provide that second factor. And you can hook into things like people's iPhones to further verify their identity through using the biometric services that are already embedded in there. So there are all sorts of interesting paths open to us now through using biometrics that are readily available through things like the iPhone to more strongly establish someone's identity.
Great. A common thread that kept coming up again and again in your presentation really was people being the weakest link. And I'd love for you to maybe unpack that a little bit in the context of organizations or startup founders on the line thinking about how they address people, culture of cybersecurity in their startups, making security a priority. Back to your comments before about people preferring to bury their head in the sand versus acknowledge that they may have been breached and accepting that actually the reality is you probably have been breached. Like, how do you go about changing culture and addressing people as the weakest link in an organization from a practical sense?
Look, to my mind, an awful lot of people focus on cybersecurity training as being the solution to this problem. People will do dumb things. I do dumb things. All of us have clicked on boxes we probably shouldn't have clicked on because we're getting annoyed with the boxes and we're trying to click through all of the screens that are appearing in front of us all the time. We all do dumb things. I even typed my password into a browser once, by accident, and then I had to change my password very quickly for obvious reasons, but I'm fessing up at this point. So to my mind, if your systems are fragile enough that they will be susceptible to people doing really dumb things, you probably haven't got a particularly well-designed and secure system. And if you are utterly reliant on training people about, cyber awareness, then, and that is your only line of defense, again, I would say that you probably haven't thought about the problem in the right way. I think a lot of people tend to think of good security being here and good usability being over here, and never the twain shall meet. Whereas to me, they are one and the same thing. If you design your systems correctly, the most secure thing you can do is also the easiest thing you can do. And then people won't make stupid mistakes. They will always do the easiest thing. If you put stupid security controls in, like the password rules I was talking about earlier, the reality is people will be ingenious in how they work around them. And that's a bit of a hint for anybody who hasn't solved the riddle I gave them earlier. But people are very creative in thinking their ways around stupid security controls. And often it's the organizations themselves being stupid about, what are they asking their staff to do that cause the problems. They actually make their own systems weaker, not stronger, paradoxically, because they've introduced a new security control.
So, Gabriel, on that paradox, give us the answer to your paradox of password resets from earlier.
Oh, give me some of the guesses first.
Oh, okay. Well, let me read through them. I'm sure someone has hit the nail on the head. Someone's got a sense of humor. Passwords haven't been hashed and salted. People forget their complex passwords. Someone was sending reminders. I'm going to go with people were too lazy to remember their password. What else have we got here? People were finding it much harder to remember passwords and it was easier to hit password reset. That's about all we've got. Did anyone hit the nail on the head?
Nope.
No? Oh, well, that's great. You and I get to split a good bottle of South Australian wine. Good.
Well, the two critical hints I gave you were, one, people are ingenious in how they think their way around problems. So that's the first critical point. The second thing that they'd done was to change the rule to say that you can't use any of your previous 10 passwords. So think about those two things in combination. What were the staff doing? Well, somebody, were fairly ingenious in this particular federal government organization, worked it out quite quickly. And they realized that if they called the help desk 10 times in a row, they could get their password back to what they wanted it to be, which was their same password as before, because they didn't want to change it in the first place. And then they told their friends. And so 3 months later, everybody was doing it. And at $60 a pop, Mr. and Mrs. EDS were running all the way to the banks saying, this is wonderful. We've never seen so many passwords and resets in any time at all. But it's the classic example to my mind of where putting in what theoretically is a stronger security control has paradoxical effects. You know, the other people, of course, just wrote it down on a sticky note and shoved it under their keyboard so they could remember it. But if you make it too difficult for people to conform to your security systems, they will find clever ways around them, or dumb ways around them, as the case may be. But that, to me, illustrates the point very well.
Very good, very good. So, I mean, the other thing that struck me in the chat was, I guess, the amount of, or the sometimes disconnect between what's written on the box of security vendor solutions and the reality of delivery and the complexity of what that creates in your organization. And you talked about, I guess, the many silver bullets that you're willing to sell people after the call. Can you maybe rattle off some of your favorite or some of the interesting or the standout or the ones to watch tools that you...
I'm not going to name and shame vendors.
Yeah, no, certainly not. Certainly not on the negative side, but on the positive side, from categories of vendor, or even just specific tools that you look at and go, this is a no-brainer, and really people should be moving with the times.
Look, I think one of the reasons I'm advocating that people don't build their own SOCs now is that the forms of attack are changing constantly, which means that the forms of defense you need are going to need to keep updating constantly. And so if you just keep going and buying yourself more and more boxes that solve part but not all of the problem, things that, for example, just do endpoint detection, but don't look at traffic, don't look at hunting, don't look at any of the other defensive techniques, you're never going to catch all of the bad guys, because the competent red teams are very, very good at working their way around these controls. They will detect their presence and they will actually work out how to actually not get detected. So, and the same is true, of course, of the hackers. They will work their way out. So some of the defense services, to my mind, are an awful lot better than others. I don't advocate any one in particular. I mean, we deal with a few of them. But I would strongly suggest that you try before you buy. Don't believe anybody's brochureware. Actually, if you think that this particular box or piece of equipment is going to solve all your security problems, plug it in on a try before you buy basis and get a competent red team in and see if it actually does detect them. You may be surprised by the results.
Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's call. Hope it was informative.